They sang about the men who crossed oceans and found new worlds. They carved statues for kings who ruled the waves. But no one speaks of the woman who stayed behind, who waited each night by a candle's dim light, listening to the winds that carried no answers. Her name was Catarina de Ataíde. You won't find her on maps. She never stood on a ship's deck or claimed lands in the name of God or crown. But the beating heart of an empire, its hope, its grief, its silence, echoed within her. While Vasco da Gama carved his name into the world with sails and steel, Catarina lived in the shadows, writing letters no one read, raising sons for a war she never chose, and holding together a legacy that history would forget to write down. In a world built for men to conquer, she learned how to endure. When the sea didn't bring her husband home, she refused to mourn. When power shifted around her, she held her ground with grace sharper than any blade. And when the empire turned to dust, her memory was the first to be swept away. But what if the story of an empire doesn't start with a voyage? What if it begins with a woman left behind? The world remembers the name Vasco da Gama. It is etched into the maps of conquest and whispered through the corridors of maritime history, a name that stands alongside Magellan and Columbus and Cabral as one of the titans who reshaped the limits of what was possible. His legacy, so carefully recorded and retold, begins with sails rising on the Tagus River and ends with an empire stretching from Lisbon to Calicut. But before the ships, before the spices, before the stars guided him across black waters, there was a marriage, and in that marriage there was a woman. She did not steer ships or raise flags, but she anchored a man who would challenge the horizon itself. Catarina de Ataíde was not born into obscurity. She was the daughter of nobility, raised within the polished stone walls of a house that echoed with Latin prayers and political ambition. Her lineage traced back to some of the most powerful families in the Portuguese kingdom, yet unlike the men around her, her worth was never measured by how many lands she conquered or how many treaties she signed. From the moment of her birth, her value was determined by how well she could bind the ambitions of others. Her future was not hers to write. It was a parchment passed between fathers, brothers, and kings, inked in duty and sealed with expectation. She was still young when her name first appeared in court whispers as a match for Vasco da Gama, a rising but rough-edged navigator with more recklessness than refinement. He was not a man molded by Lisbon's salons or clerical politics, but by sea winds and the smell of tar. Catarina had never met a man like him. He spoke in practical terms, never lingered on poetry or pretense. Yet when she was presented with the possibility of marrying him, she said nothing, neither protest nor praise. Silence in her world was not weakness. It was wisdom. Their marriage was arranged not for love but for strategy. Vasco needed legitimacy in the eyes of the court. Catarina's family needed influence with the crown's most daring navigator. And the crown itself, greedy for India's spices and the church's blessing, saw in their union a symbol of divine favor. So they were wed in a ceremony that was more political than romantic, beneath the carved saints of a cathedral too vast for their own voices to fill. No great poems were written that day. No roses tossed upon the waves. Just two names joined in holy alliance. A contract stitched into the sails of Portugal's future. Catarina did not cry on her wedding night. She did not sigh at the absence of sonnets or the harshness of her husband's hands, calloused from rope and blade. She knew what marriage was meant to be in her world. A stage for obedience, a vessel for heirs. And yet, as weeks turned into months, she began to sense a rhythm in Vasco that others missed. Beneath his silence, there was tension, not cruelty, but weight. He carried the pressure of centuries. It was in those quiet hours, after the servants had gone and the candles burned low, that Catarina began to understand the mind of the man she had married. He was not in love with her. He was in love with the unknown, with the idea that somewhere, just beyond the reach of Portugal's shores, lay a world he was meant to command. And she, though uninvited into that vision, chose not to resent it. Instead, she listened. She asked questions. She became not a partner in conquest but a witness to it. When the orders came for Vasco's first voyage to the Indies, there was no celebration in their home. The court praised him, the nobles drank in his name, but Catarina felt only the chill of absence. He packed with efficiency, not farewell. He kissed her once before leaving, but it was not affection, it was punctuation. A period at the end of a sentence neither of them had written. He boarded his ship, and she returned to her chamber, alone. In the months that followed, Catarina became an absence within an absence. She withdrew from the court, ignored the calls of her family to remarry or to immerse herself in noble society. Instead, she kept a journal. She began writing letters to Vasco, though she had no certainty they would ever reach him. Each one started with the same line, "If you return." They were never sealed, never sent. She kept them in a small wooden box beneath her bed, as if storing faith in the cracks of pine and dust. She ran the household with discipline, not detachment. She paid the servants, oversaw the finances, ensured their sons were educated not only in scripture and swordsmanship but in the silence of endurance. She did not weep in public. When other noblewomen mocked her for dressing in black, as if preemptively mourning a man not yet dead, she responded with a gaze that turned laughter into silence. She did not argue. She never needed to. Years passed. Rumors came and went. News of Vasco's fleet spotted off the coast of Africa. Tales of storms that swallowed entire ships. Whispers of mutiny, of massacre. Catarina listened but never speculated. She knew that men told stories the way merchants sold silk. For profit, not truth. Her belief was not in what was said, but in what was felt. And she felt, deep in the bones of her hands, in the threads of the letters she wrote, that he would return. When he finally did, gaunt and hollow-eyed but alive, he brought with him more than spices. He carried ghosts. He spoke little of what he had seen, of what he had done. The court welcomed him as a hero. The church anointed him a servant of divine destiny. But when he stood in their chamber once more, Catarina saw the weight behind his eyes, the toll of conquest, of blood spilled in foreign lands, of men buried beneath foreign stars. She did not ask for stories. She only said, "You are home." They resumed life not as lovers but as co-conspirators in a game history had already begun to write. She became his confidant, his shield in courtly intrigue, the mother of his heirs and the keeper of his legacy. And though he would leave again, always chasing the horizon, she remained, not as a shadow but as a lighthouse, a quiet flame in a world that praised thunder. And so began the true voyage of Catarina de Ataíde, not across oceans, but through time, not with sails but with silence, not with conquest, but with conviction. The house was quiet long before the sun disappeared, the kind of quiet that sinks into the walls and lingers in the corners, long after the servants have swept the floors and drawn the curtains. Catarina de Ataíde moved through it like a ghost not yet dead, her footsteps muffled by velvet and years. The sea had taken Vasco once again, and with him it had taken the shape of her world. What remained was not absence, but echo. She had learned early that grief could not be trusted in public. Among the noble families of Lisbon, emotion was a weakness reserved for the poor. The wives of admirals and governors knew better than to cry in court. Instead, they wore their mourning like armor, spoke in polished platitudes, and waited in long hallways for news that rarely arrived unfiltered. But Catarina did not grieve like the others. Her silence was not submission. It was a decision. She chose to feel everything, privately, fiercely, and alone. The chamber she claimed for herself was small by noble standards, tucked in the eastern wing of the estate, with a narrow window overlooking the garden and, in the distance, the glint of the Tagus River. On clear days, she could see the sails departing, like white moths chasing the wind. On stormy nights, she would stand there for hours, watching the rain stitch lines down the glass, wondering if the same storm howled above her husband's ship. It was in this room that she began to write. The first letter began simply, If you return. Those 3 words carried the weight of 1,000 questions she dared not ask aloud. She filled the page with thoughts too dangerous for courtly speech. Her fears, her doubts, her anger, but also her dreams. She wrote of their children, of the way their youngest curled his toes when he slept, of the way their eldest recited scripture with too much fire in his voice. She wrote of the garden, how the roses bloomed late that year, how the olive trees bent in the wind but never broke. She wrote of the emptiness in the bed, the way the air still smelled like him some nights, and how that scent kept her awake. The letters became ritual. Each evening, after prayers, she would sit at the oak desk by the window and write. She never dated them, never signed her name. Sometimes, she would stop mid-sentence and fold the parchment away, unfinished, like a conversation that had run out of time. She kept them in a carved cedar box, one Vasco had given her before his first voyage. Inside, the letters became a kind of second self. Pages stitched with longing, ink soaked in absence. She never sent them. She told no one. Not the housemaids who brought her tea. Not the priests who came to offer counsel. Even her sons, who came and went like shadows, sensed the room was sacred but never asked why. The box remained beneath her bed, a secret archive of a life no one else could see. In time, the letters began to change. The words grew sharper, more precise. She no longer wrote as a wife waiting for her husband. She wrote as a woman witnessing history from the margins, cataloging the empire that was rising around her, brick by bloody brick. She wrote of the spices arriving from India, how the streets of Lisbon now reeked of cinnamon and clove, how the court's appetite had turned insatiable. She described the banquets thrown in Vasco's honor, the way men toasted him with gold goblets and then whispered curses behind closed doors. She wrote of the merchants who profited from his conquests, the clergy who praised his piety while blessing the ships that carried weapons instead of salvation. Catarina saw what others refused to, the cost of glory, not just in the bodies of foreign men, but in the transformation of her own people. The Portugal Vasco returned to was not the one he had left, and neither was she. Her writing became bolder. She questioned the moral compass of the crown, the ethics of conquest, the hollow nature of victory measured in coins and corpses. Yet even as her thoughts darkened, she kept her tone measured. There was a kind of power in restraint. These were not letters of rebellion. They were letters of record. If no one else would remember the truth, she would. One winter, when the rivers froze and the hearths burned low, Catarina fell ill. Her body weakened, but her hands did not. She wrote through the fever, her letters trembling, ink smudged by coughs. She wrote of dreams that felt like memories, of standing on a beach, watching Vasco walk into the waves, his silhouette swallowed by fog, of voices calling her name in languages she did not understand, of ships with no sails, drifting toward a shore she couldn't see. When she recovered, her letters turned inward. She began to write about her own soul, about the weight of expectation, about the loneliness of being the woman behind the hero. She wrote of the nights she wished she had been born a man, not for power or adventure, but simply to be seen, to be remembered. She wrote of legacy, and how some were carved in stone while others were buried in silence. And then, one morning, she stopped. She walked to the box, opened it and removed every letter. She laid them across the floor, one by one, in a long line that stretched from her bed to the hearth. The ink had faded on some, the parchment curled at the edges. She read them aloud, her voice soft at first, then firmer. It was not a performance. It was an exorcism. When she reached the last letter, she did not cry. She did not fold it. She placed it gently in the fire. The flames rose slowly, devouring her words without complaint. Smoke curled around her fingers, and for a moment, she imagined her letters riding the wind out to sea, finding Vasco wherever he was, whispering her truths into the darkness between stars. She burned every letter but one, the first. If you return. She folded it carefully, tied it with a red ribbon, and placed it back in the box. Then she locked it, Years later, after Vasco's final departure, after the news of his death arrived like a cold tide breaking on warm sand, Catarina opened the box again. The letter was still there. The ink had faded, but the words had not. She read them aloud one last time, then placed the parchment beneath a loose stone in the chapel wall, where no one would find it. Not immediately, perhaps not ever, but Catarina believed in echoes. She believed that one day, someone would hear hers. The sun never quite lit the halls of Lisbon's royal court. Even in the height of summer, the walls remained cold, the stone steps slick with the echo of centuries. It was a place built for power, not warmth, a cathedral of calculation where whispers meant more than proclamations. And within this fortress of ritual and authority, Catarina de Ataíde walked like a relic out of place, a figure cloaked not just in black but in knowing. She had not asked for a seat at the table. Her name was rarely spoken aloud in the royal chambers. She was not a queen, not an emissary, not a force that anyone claimed to fear, but her presence had begun to draw attention, not through declarations, but through the precision of her stillness. She arrived when she was not expected, stood in corners that others passed without noticing, and when she spoke only once. The silence that followed did the rest. It was during the second voyage of Vasco da Gama that the court began to shift. Portugal's first contact with India had not brought the harmony the church had promised. It brought blood. Gold followed, yes, spices and silk and stories of kingdoms beyond the maps, but so did violence. The native rulers of the East were not so eager to surrender. The priests sent to convert them returned in boxes or not at all. Ships arrived in Lisbon bearing treasures wrapped in red-stained cloth. And yet the crown did not falter. The king celebrated each shipment like divine confirmation, praising Vasco as a savior of the realm. Statues were discussed. A new wing of the palace was designed to house the spoils of righteousness. The merchants smiled. The clergy nodded. And behind them all, in a chamber lined with crosses and velvet, Catarina stood alone and watched. She had begun to suspect something darker behind the empire's expansion. It was not righteousness that drove it, but appetite. The men who sat closest to the king were not saints, but scavengers, nobles whose bloodlines depended on constant acquisition, priests whose sermons veiled contracts in scripture. There were rumors of deals struck in advance, of territories divided long before they were seen, of cartographers sketching coastlines based on prophecy, not reality. Catarina received no official reports, but she didn't need them. Information came to her by different means, through servants, through women whose names no man in court ever bothered to learn, chambermaids who changed linens in the royal study, kitchen workers who overheard merchants brag over roast duck and Madeira, widows whose husbands had been lost at sea, their homes now repurposed for new campaigns. She listened to them all, and in their stories, she began to glimpse a shadow larger than any map could hold. She began writing again, not letters this time, but records. Not for Vasco, for posterity. She used simple parchment, hidden behind false backs in her armoire. Each page bore a date, a name, a single sentence. The bishop who accepted 5 chests of saffron in exchange for silence, the admiral who doctored reports before submitting them to the crown, the merchant who returned with 3 ships and 30 fewer men than he had taken. She did not accuse. She documented. She also prayed, but not for safety. She prayed for clarity. She knelt beneath the crucifix in the family chapel and stared at the feet of Christ, wondering what kind of God would choose one nation over another, what kind of heaven demanded so much earth to be soaked in blood. She found no answers, only more silence. And in that silence, her conviction hardened. The court began to feel her presence differently. The queen's ladies-in-waiting avoided her gaze. The Bishop of Braga stopped offering his blessing when she passed. Some whispered that she had become melancholic, touched by grief. Others suspected witchcraft, a convenient explanation for any woman who saw too clearly. But Catarina neither confirmed nor denied. She understood the economy of rumors. She let them spend themselves. Then came the letters from Vasco. For years, she had written to him without knowing if her words would reach the sea. Now, finally, his words returned. But they were not the words of a hero. They were dry, factual, stripped of metaphor. He spoke of negotiations in Calicut, of alliances betrayed, of cities burned. He mentioned a boy, 14 years old, who had been gifted to him as tribute. A translator, they said, a gift of loyalty. Vasco referred to the child as useful. Catarina read the letter twice. Then she burned it. She did not cry. She did not scream. She returned to her chamber and added a single line to her hidden ledger. There is no honor in the heat of conquest. Shortly after, she received an invitation from the queen herself. A luncheon formally innocent, but politically charged. It was rare for Catarina to be summoned directly, rarer still to accept, but she did. She dressed simply, as always, and wore a single piece of jewelry, a locket containing a strand of her youngest son's hair. The gathering was small. The queen, 2 duchesses, a pair of advisors, and Catarina. They spoke of weather, of music, of the growing importance of cinnamon in perfume. Then, as the servants cleared the plates, the queen leaned forward and smiled. "Lady Catarina," she said, "what do you believe your husband is building for us?" Catarina did not answer at once. She took a sip of wine, then set the goblet down with precision. Her voice was soft. "An empire," she said, "but not for us." The room fell quiet. The queen's smile held, but only just. One of the duchesses laughed, nervous, brittle. Another reached for her rosary, a reflex. No one spoke again for several minutes. That evening, Catarina returned home and placed the locket on her desk. She opened her ledger and added another entry. "When a woman tells the truth, they call it prophecy. Then they bury her with the stars." She knew now that her position was untenable. She was no longer invisible. She had drawn attention not through power, but through perception. And in a court that thrived on appearances, perception could be fatal. But she also knew something they did not. She had already buried too much to be afraid of being forgotten. She spent the following weeks preparing. Not for exile, not for confrontation, but for continuation. She arranged for her children's education to be managed by a scholar from Salamanca, one who had written treatises on both theology and astronomy. She revised the household accounts, ensuring that funds were hidden across 3 monasteries under false names. She commissioned a young artist, newly arrived from Seville, to paint a portrait of her, not for vanity, but for preservation, not for display, but for remembrance. She instructed the artist to paint her not as a noblewoman, but as she was in private. Seated by the window, the sea in the distance, her hands holding a quill and a piece of parchment, a single candle burning beside her. "Do not make me beautiful," she said. "Make me truthful." The artist complied. When the painting was finished, she did not show it to anyone. She had it sealed in a crate and sent to a convent outside Coimbra, with instructions that it be opened only 50 years after her death. And then she waited. For what, she did not know. But she understood now that history was not written in the moment. It was written in hindsight, often by men who had never tasted the ash of sacrifice. She had no delusions that her name would echo through the ages. But she had come to believe in something deeper than fame. She believed in traces, in shadows, in the possibility that one day, someone, perhaps a woman not yet born, would find her footprints beneath the dust of empire and remember that even in silence, there was resistance. Catarina no longer prayed beneath the crucifix. She prayed in the garden, beneath the olive trees, where no walls stood between her and the sky. She did not ask for mercy. She asked for memory. And when the wind passed through the branches and the leaves whispered, she imagined they carried her words far beyond Lisbon, beyond the sea, beyond the maps, into the hearts of those who might finally listen. The news did not come with trumpets or ceremony. It arrived instead as a whisper, carried through back corridors and behind embroidered fans, dropped like a pebble into the still waters of a drawing room, causing no ripples at first. Vasco da Gama was dead. That was the rumor. A fever in Cochin. Or a knife in Calicut. Or poison, some said, slipped into his cup by a sultan who smiled too sweetly. No one knew for sure. But the sea, it seemed, had finally claimed the man who had once commanded it. Catarina heard the rumor before the royal court confirmed it. It was a merchant's daughter who told her, speaking quickly between fits of breath after running across the northern plaza. They say his ship returned with only bones. The girl whispered, eyes wide. Catarina did not respond. She merely placed her hand on the girl's shoulder and sent her away with a slice of bread and a coin. Then she walked back into her home and closed the door behind her. There was no official announcement. No black banners over the palace gates. The crown said nothing, not at first. The king's advisors weighed the implications of confirming the death of an icon before understanding what that death might cost them. The merchants feared a drop in spice prices. The clergy, always eager to sanctify the fallen, waited for details they could shape into martyrdom. And Catarina, as always, waited in silence. But she did not mourn. The household staff expected a transformation. They prepared the mourning garments, darkened the windows, and lowered their voices. But Catarina made no changes. She wore the same dresses she had worn before. She took her meals at the same hour. She walked the gardens without weeping, without faltering. When the housekeeper gently asked whether she would be receiving guests in black, Catarina looked at her for a long moment and said, "I am not a widow." It was not denial. It was something deeper. Catarina had spent her life navigating the absence of certainty. She knew that death did not always come with a body, nor truth with a proclamation. And she knew better than to let men decide when a woman became a widow. A title, after all, was only useful if it gave you power. And Catarina had never sought power in the names others gave her. But the world did not like ambiguity. Lisbon expected its widows to perform. There were ceremonies to be attended, condolences to be exchanged, a theater of grief that women were expected to play with grace and tears. When Catarina refused the role, the whispers returned. They called her heartless, cold, unnatural. Some claimed she had long hated her husband and now rejoiced in his death. Others suggested darker things, that she had conspired with those in the Indies to end his life, that she had poisoned his memory before the sea ever had the chance. Catarina did not respond. She never had. But in the quiet, she began to write again. Not letters, not records, but reflections. She filled page after page with thoughts too complicated for confession, too dangerous for sermon. She wrote about the performance of grief, about how the world demanded that women prove their sorrow in ways that served the comfort of others. She wrote about absence, not just Vasco's but her own, how she had disappeared slowly over the years, not into death, but into the walls of a story written by men. She reflected on their last parting. It had been like the others, brief, functional, with few words. Vasco had not looked back as he boarded the ship. He never did, and she had not called after him. It was not a lack of love. It was an understanding that love, in their world, could not survive in the open. It had to be carried quietly, like a relic too sacred for sunlight. She remembered his hands, how they had trembled slightly when he held a quill, not from fear, but from memory. Too many ropes, too many swords, too many storms. She remembered how he once confessed that the sea was not what frightened him. It was land. Land with its politics, its expectations, its illusions of permanence. He had been built for movement, for elsewhere, and she had been built for remaining. Now she remained. The crown eventually confirmed his death, weeks later, in a formal statement read by a courtier whose voice cracked in the middle. Vasco da Gama had died in service to God and country, they said, surrounded by loyal men and noble purpose. The statement was brief. There was no mention of Catarina, no mention of children, no mention of silence. But with the confirmation came new visitors. Priests arrived with condolences and requests for donations to build chapels in Vasco's name. Artists asked for her blessing to create sculptures. Writers sent drafts of poems praising his courage. Catarina received them all with courtesy. Then she declined every offer, every statue, every line of verse. She did not believe that legacy was a thing to be carved from marble or stitched into him. Instead, she went to the family chapel and knelt, not before the altar, but before the stone wall where she had once hidden the first letter she ever wrote to him. She removed the stone carefully, like touching the forehead of a sleeping child, and retrieved the parchment. The ribbon was faded, the ink barely legible, but the words were still there. "If you return." She read the letter aloud, not as a widow but as a witness. Then she folded it again and placed it back behind the stone. She replaced the cover and stood in the flickering light of the chapel, her hands steady. She was not waiting anymore. She was remembering. In the months that followed, she began to appear in court again, but not as before. She spoke rarely, but when she did, men listened. They called her the widow of the ocean, part legend, part warning. She did not correct them. Let them believe she belonged to the sea. It was easier than explaining that she belonged to nothing now, and to no one. She began to mentor younger women in the court, daughters of merchants, nieces of barons, teaching them how to listen for the truths beneath flattery, how to guard their names, how to keep pieces of themselves untouched by the hands of ambition. She never claimed authority, but influence, like grief, does not always need permission. She also traveled, for the first time in decades, not far, just beyond the edges of Lisbon, to convents and coastal villages, places where the empire's shadow had not yet choked the light. She listened to women who had never seen a map but knew the shape of hunger, the taste of salt in their lungs from too many nights waiting at the harbor. She wrote their stories down. She folded them into her own. She began to believe that perhaps her role had never been to support a hero, but to survive the myth of him. And when she walked alone along the cliffs above the sea, where the wind howled with the voices of 1,000 lost men, she no longer looked for sails. She looked inward, at the things she had built without anyone's permission, at the children she had raised, not for glory, but for conscience, at the memory she had crafted, not to be honored, but to be heard. Catarina de Ataíde was no longer a bride, and she had never been a widow. She was something else entirely. The harbor groaned under the weight of returning sails, not in celebration, but in exhaustion. The air that morning was neither crisp nor clean. It smelled of salt and rotting wood and something heavier, something closer to death than victory. The crowd that gathered by the docks did not sing. There were no garlands, no drums, no cries of joy. They stood in silence, as if waiting for a funeral procession they hadn't been invited to. The ships of the India fleet were back. What they brought was not glory. It was loss. Catarina did not need an official summons. She had felt the return before any town crier rang his bell. It was in the wind that crept through her windows, in the uneasy murmurs of her staff, in the way her own bones ached with memory. She walked to the edge of the Tagus that morning, shrouded not in black but in the plain gray of mourning unfinished. A widow without a body, a mother without certainty. The first ship docked with a shudder. Its sails sagged like skin clinging to broken ribs. Men staggered onto the pier, gaunt and sun-wrecked, their eyes hollowed by months at sea. Most carried nothing. A few carried crates, but no one looked at them. The cargo was not what held the crowd's attention. It was the third ship that carried them, the bodies, laid in rows, wrapped in canvas, some bearing crude crosses, others nameless. Limbs stiff and twisted, faces bloated or skeletal. The crew moved around them with the numbness of men who had seen too much. Priests came to bless them, but their prayers sounded like apologies. Catarina stood apart, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. She did not search the faces. She knew none of them belonged to Vasco. His body, if lost, would not return to her in this way. What she looked for was something else, something unspoken. And then she saw it. A boy, no older than 10, standing alone near the edge of the dock, his skin dark like sunburned copper, his clothes torn and blood-stained. No one stood near him. He was not among the dead, nor quite among the living. Just there, watching. His eyes met Catarina's, and something inside her turned. She walked toward him slowly, her steps silent against the groaning wood. No one stopped her. When she reached him, she did not speak. She knelt to his level and extended her hand. The boy looked down at it for a long time before placing his own hand in hers. It was cold. He had no name, or at least none anyone bothered to remember. The crew referred to him as the page. He had been taken in Calicut or traded or rescued. No one knew. No one cared. Catarina took him home. She did not ask where he came from. She asked where he had been. He told her, in broken Portuguese, about the fires, the screams, the way the ships burned not just towns but temples, and how the smell of spice was always mixed with blood. He told her about the men who died from sickness, from sun, from thirst, how some were thrown overboard still breathing, how others begged to be. At night he screamed in his sleep. Catarina sat beside him when he did, whispering words in a language he didn't understand, but whose rhythm soothed something inside him. She gave him a name, Tomas, not because she wanted to erase who he had been, but because he deserved a name that someone would say gently. In the weeks that followed, crates began to arrive at the house. Not just spices, but items Vasco had sent before his death. Gifts, reports, weapons. Among them, a journal. It was not a private diary, but a ship's log, cold, factual, detached. It chronicled dates, coordinates, exchanges. But between the lines, Catarina read what wasn't written. The omissions, the casual tone used to describe slaughter, the euphemisms for plunder. Secured cooperation meant torching a village. Neutralized threat meant execution. Requisitioned goods meant looting temples. She read each entry with a calm born not of apathy, but of resolve. She wrote notes in the margins, questions, rebuttals, a second narrative etched in softer ink, a voice not meant to erase, but to remember. Then came the letter, sealed in black wax, from the king. Praised Vasco's service. It thanked Catarina for her sacrifice. It offered a pension, a title, land, legacy, and one request, that she allow a state funeral complete with mass procession and monument. Catarina read it once, then again. She placed it beside the journal, stared at them both, and asked herself one question. What truly was being buried? It wasn't Vasco. His body was in Goa, perhaps, or lost, or forgotten in some sand-covered grave on a foreign shore. What the crown wanted to bury was consequence, complexity, the bodies on the docks, the boy in her home, the truth in the margins. She declined the funeral. Instead, she held a private service in the family chapel. No procession, no court, just her sons, the boy, a priest who asked no questions, and a candle lit not for Vasco, but for every man whose name did not appear in the logs. She read from the journal aloud. Not the sanitized parts, but the dark ones. She read them in full voice, letting the silence afterward settle like ash. When it was done, she placed the journal on the altar, beside the single letter Vasco had sent her that held anything close to tenderness. Tomas placed a flower on the step. Afterward, she walked alone to the edge of the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind howled. The clouds curled like ink. She closed her eyes and listened, not for the sound of waves, but for something deeper, the voices beneath them, the ones who had not returned, the ones no monument would honor. She whispered their names, even if she didn't know them, and when she opened her eyes again, the sea looked different. Not vast, not beautiful, not eternal, but full, a sea of bones. The empire marched on with or without its heroes. Ships still sailed. Coins still clinked. Spices still perfumed the breath of Lisbon's markets. And cartographers still drew bolder lines across seas they had never seen. But within the stone walls of a house that no longer echoed with the voice of its admiral, Catarina de Ataíde turned her attention to something more enduring than legacy. Lineage. She had 3 sons still living. The eldest bore Vasco's name and ambition, already studying navigation and military theory with a hunger that worried her. The second, quieter, preferred books to blades, and spent his afternoons in the cloisters of Dominican friars, sketching the margins of scripture. The youngest was still more shadow than boy, his memory of his father no more than a portrait and a title spoken in reverent tones. Then there was Tomas, the boy with no past, no nation, no claim to the empire whose ships had stolen him. He had been given nothing except survival. And Catarina had chosen, deliberately, to give him more. She began to build her world around them, not as a matron seeking control, but as a custodian of memory. She understood that empires were not only forged in metal and fire. They were inherited in thought, in rhythm, in what the next generation chose to question or accept. She created a curriculum not for conquest, but for conscience. The boys were taught languages, not just Latin and Portuguese but Arabic, Tamil, and Sanskrit, through books smuggled in from merchant scholars. They learned geography not from imperial charts, but from oral stories told by sailors who had no homeland. They studied theology alongside philosophy, scripture beside silence. For every lesson in history, Catarina required them to write a second version, from the point of view of the conquered. She turned the chapel into a place not of worship, but of inquiry. The altar became a desk. The crucifix remained, but beside it she placed objects from Vasco's voyages. A fragment of embroidered cloth from Calicut, a brass idol from the Malabar coast, a burned page from a destroyed library in Mombasa. Each artifact was paired with a question. What was this before we touched it? The house changed, slowly, like a wound becoming a scar. Laughter returned, not often but truthfully. The boys wrestled in the gardens. Tomas learned to read. The servants began to speak more openly. Some brought their children to Catarina's doorstep, asking if she might teach them too. She did not say no. The neighbors, of course, gossiped. They always had. That Catarina was educating not just noble sons but orphans and pages and fisherwomen's daughters was not just strange. It was subversive. Rumors swirled that she was building her own sect, a cult of memory or worse, of mercy. In the court, whispers rose that perhaps she had gone too long without the tempering influence of a husband. Catarina did not respond. She planted more olive trees. She taught the children how to tend them, how to recognize when the soil was sick, how to prune without wounding, how to harvest without greed. Everything that lives, she told them, has a rhythm. Your job is to listen before you act. It was not a metaphor. It was law. And it began to work. Estevao, the eldest, resisted at first. He was too much like his father in the way boys often are when they idolize men they never understood. He craved structure, rank, clarity. But Catarina gave him none. She assigned him to tend Tomas's lessons. First he scoffed. Then he began to stay longer after the others left. One day, Catarina overheard him reciting poetry in Tamil. His voice unsure but sincere. She said nothing. The olive trees were blooming early that year. The second son, Alvaro, began translating journals from the East into Portuguese, sometimes without being asked. He left annotated pages on Catarina's desk, passages about medicine, governance, art. One day he wrote in the margin, "They had a library older than Lisbon. We burned it." Catarina traced the ink with her finger. She placed a small flower between the pages and returned the journal to his desk, unsaid but understood. The youngest, Martim, began building boats out of wax and parchment. He set them afloat in the courtyard fountain. Each one bore a flag he designed himself, none of them marked with crosses or royal sigils. One day, he asked Catarina if ships could carry stories instead of soldiers. She kissed the top of his head and said, "Only the best ones do." And Tomas, he grew taller, quieter. His Portuguese became fluent. He began to dream aloud, not of revenge or return but of voice. He wanted to write. He wanted to tell his own story, not as a footnote in someone else's conquest, but as a flame in the dark. Catarina gave him paper, ink, a seat at her table. There were still hard days. The world outside had not changed. Ships still left Lisbon every month, bound for ports the crown claimed and peoples it never cared to understand. Soldiers still marched. Priests still baptized children whose names they couldn't pronounce. But inside the estate, a different tide was rising, one not of empire, but of reckoning. One spring, a delegation from the crown arrived, unannounced. 3 men in crimson robes, bearing gold-rimmed seals and smiles too tight. They claimed to be checking in on the family's affairs. They asked about Esteveo's education, Alvaro's writings, Martim's games. Then they asked, pointedly, about Tomas. Catarina listened without blinking. When they finished their questions, she walked to the wall where Vasco's portrait hung. She stared at it for a moment. Then she turned back and said, "He is my son." The men shifted. One of them cleared his throat. "That is irregular, my lady." "No," Catarina replied. "It is history." The delegation left without further comment. The next week, a notice arrived from the court. Esteveo was to be named honorary aide to the Admiralty. Catarina accepted the honor but sent a message of her own, written in careful calligraphy. Before he serves the sea, he must serve memory. Years passed like seasons. The olive trees grew thick. The children grew older. The lessons continued. Catarina began to write again. Not letters, not ledgers, but teachings. Not doctrine, but reflections. She called them Meditators Paraphilios du Mar. Meditations for the children of the sea. Not just for her sons, but for anyone born in the wake of empire. Each passage bore no name, only a question, and the echo of an answer. What if conquest is not strength, but fear dressed in armor? Who records the tears of those who do not speak your language? What is the weight of silence? When spoken by a mother, she never published them. She bound them by hand, in soft leather, and placed them on a shelf beside her bed. She called it her true inheritance. When people asked in later years how the Gama line had produced sons who advocated for diplomacy, for scholarship, for restraint, they credited the shifting winds of Europe, the softening of empire, the influence of Rome. But the truth was simpler. They had been raised by a woman who knew that power, untempered by memory, was nothing but ash. She had taught them not just how to live, but how to remember. And so, in the quiet spaces between conquest, in the gardens where empire could not reach, Catarina planted the seeds of something larger than land. She became not a mother of sons, but a mother of thought. The kind of mother from whom empires learn to weep. They did not wear crowns, but their footsteps echoed through the marble halls just the same. They did not sit on thrones, but their hands shaped the rhythm of the court, steady as the tide beneath the keel of a ship. They were the other queens, women born into palaces but buried beneath titles like consort, dowager, lady, or worse, forgotten entirely. Catarina knew them not through ceremony, but through silence. It was there, in the pauses between courtly obligation, that she first began to see them for what they truly were: architects of continuity, sentinels of legacy, and guardians of truths that could never be spoken aloud. Her own place in court was tenuous by design. She came when summoned, rarely of her own will. Her name was listed behind generals and bishops, behind merchants whose coin had purchased proximity to the king. She did not seek influence in public, but influence found her nonetheless, drawn not to ambition, but to presence. The younger ladies of court watched her movements with caution and curiosity. The older ones watched with memory. It was during a winter marked by political unrest, rebellions in the north, rumors of Dutch incursions in the east, that the queen summoned Catarina privately. Not to a banquet or a chapel, but to a garden courtyard shuttered against the cold. There, beneath a sky the color of ash, Catarina was invited to walk. The queen spoke in measured tones, of policy, of succession, of fears not easily named. She spoke of the pressure bearing down upon the realm, the weight of trade routes fraying like old rope, of alliances slipping beneath the surface. Catarina listened, her eyes not on the queen, but on the withered vines climbing the stone walls. And then, the queen asked the question that changed the nature of the conversation. "What is your opinion, as a woman?" It was not a trap. It was a reaching hand. Catarina answered slowly, not with advice, but with truth, that the realm was not threatened by enemies abroad, but by blindness within. That power had become a room full of mirrors, where men admired themselves and saw no cracks. That empire could not be sustained by blood alone, or it would drown in it. The queen said nothing for a long time. But after that day, Catarina began to receive invitations, not formal edicts, but folded notes sealed in lavender wax. They came from women with titles and those without, from the widow of a former ambassador, from the daughter of a Moorish scribe baptized into courtly grace but never truly accepted, from the sister of a cardinal who had died in a scandal the church refused to name, from a duchess whose lands were being stripped to fund expeditions she had never supported. They met in libraries, in private gardens, in the corners of salons where men laughed too loudly to hear anything else. And in those quiet spaces, they shared what had been denied them in the official histories. Opinion, observation, outrage. They spoke in riddles, in parables, in veiled metaphors. But Catarina understood. They were building something, not a rebellion, not a conspiracy, but a map of knowledge the crown could never chart. They compared notes on merchant behaviors, on diplomatic gestures dismissed by their husbands but remembered by them. They tracked which families rose and fell, who owed debts to whom, which monasteries were moving gold. They began to compile their own records, not to use as weapons but as shields. Memory, Catarina had long believed, was the only armor time could not pierce. It was in one such meeting in a chapel converted to a music room that a marquis's widow produced a letter, one smuggled from Goa, written by a dying priest. In it, the priest detailed atrocities committed not only by soldiers but by crown-sanctioned agents. Executions without trial. Entire families erased. Religious leaders silenced by bribes or blades. The letter had been intercepted before reaching the Vatican. Catarina read it in silence. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She looked up and asked, "Do we know the names of the victims?" The widow shook her head. "Then we must find them," Catarina said. It became a new project. The names, the forgotten, the silenced. They scoured manifests, journals, shipping logs. They paid scribes in secret to translate intercepted messages. They asked questions disguised as gossip. And slowly, painfully, the list began to grow. Catarina called it the hidden court. Not in jest, not in arrogance, but because that was what it was. A council of queens without crowns, ruling nothing but remembrance. Their work was dangerous, not because they plotted against the throne, but because they remembered what the throne wished to forget. One of their number disappeared, quietly, without scandal. A lady-in-waiting who had asked one too many questions about a Jesuit treasury. Her absence was explained with a single word: illness. Catarina lit a candle for her every night for a month. Another was married off to a distant cousin of the king, sent to a manor near the edge of Spain. She wrote letters back, none of which mentioned politics, but she drew small birds in the margins. Birds with clipped wings. The message was clear, and still they continued. Catarina began to realize that history did not fear rebellion. It feared record-keeping. It feared women who wrote things down. She began copying every page of their findings by hand. She stored them in hidden compartments in her home, behind false panels and beneath tiles. She taught Tomas to do the same. She told him that one day, the empire would claim it had never done harm, that it had only brought light to darkness, and that when that day came, these pages would be lanterns in a very long night. One evening, as she walked through the halls of the palace for a rare appearance at a winter feast, she caught sight of herself in a mirror. Older now, hair streaked with gray, face lined not with sorrow, but with use. She did not look like the woman Vasco had married. She looked like the sum of everything that had been buried and yet survived. She passed a group of young noblewomen who paused in their laughter as she walked by. One of them whispered, "That's the admiral's widow." Another corrected her, "No, that's the queen behind the curtain." Catarina said nothing, but that night she stood in her private chapel and lit a candle. Not for Vasco, not for Portugal, not even for herself. She lit it for the women whose names would never be written in stained glass or stone, but who had held up the empire with nothing but grit and grace. The candle flickered, dancing shadows across the wall, and in that moment Catarina knew, if history would not name them queens, then memory must. The salt was everywhere. It lingered in the streets, caked into the boots of sailors and merchants. It crusted the arches of warehouses where barrels of spice were stacked like relics of a rising faith. It drifted in the air above Lisbon's markets, mingling with the sharp scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove, perfumes of a distant violence polished into wealth. Salt carved itself into the windows of churches and the cracks of palaces. It was in the tears of widows and the sweat of dockworkers, in the meat of banquets and the coins exchanged after Mass. Portugal had become a kingdom of salt, and its crown, though golden, had begun to corrode. Catarina saw it first not in war, but in wealth. After Vasco's death, and the formal confirmation of his titles and estates, the king's ministers moved quickly. They sent officials to audit his holdings, to appraise the value of what he had brought back from the east. Caravans arrived at Catarina's gates with scrolls and scales, with polished words and cold eyes. They came not to mourn, but to measure. They valued ivory and pepper, silks and gemstones. They tallied warehouses, counted cannons, recorded how many native interpreters Vasco had acquired. They asked Catarina to surrender all official logs, correspondence, and shipping manifests. She gave them what they asked, what they expected. What they didn't ask for, she kept. One evening, as the king's steward read aloud a decree naming Estevao as heir to the admiral's legacy, Catarina watched the man's lips form each syllable as if rehearsed. The decree was ceremonial, a gesture meant to appease bloodlines. But beneath its ink ran an unspoken agreement. The empire would continue, so long as the family remained useful. The steward paused when Catarina did not respond. He waited for her to speak. Some word of gratitude, some acknowledgement of royal favor. But Catarina only nodded once, turned her gaze toward the ledger in her lap, and resumed writing. She knew what this was. Not honor, not reward. It was transaction. The empire did not run on loyalty. It ran on return. In the months that followed, Catarina received dozens of letters, from merchants, investors, foreign nobles, all expressing interest in partnerships. They offered coin, protection, influence. Some promised to elevate her name even further, to link the Gama line to other rising powers across Europe. But none of them spoke of conscience. None spoke of the bodies behind the ledgers. Catarina replied to none of them. Instead, she began her own audit, not of goods, but of truths. She returned to Vasco's ledgers, but this time with a different lens. She traced the routes of shipments alongside the journal entries of sailors. She compared the weight of cargo with the number of graves marked along the coasts of India, Africa, and Arabia. She wrote equations in the margins, not of profit but of consequence. For every crate of cardamom, how many burned temples? For every pound of pepper, how many children taken? For every gold ingot, how many names erased? It was a new arithmetic, one not taught in court. Tomas helped her now. He had grown into a young man, quiet, observant, precise. His Portuguese was flawless, but his memory carried other languages. He remembered the dialect of his mother. He remembered the chants of the priests who had died in fire. And he began to write not just as a student, but as a witness. He and Catarina compiled a separate account, the Book of Cost. It was not bound in leather, nor written in gold, just plain parchment, with rows of tallies that marked the invisible ledger of empire. They did not share it, not yet. It was not ready, but it was real. Meanwhile, Estevao began his own journey. He had joined the Admiralty, as expected, But his letters home bore traces of something more than obedience. He wrote of his discomfort with the raids, of the way governors in the East ruled not with justice but with fear. He spoke of a captain who ordered a village torched because a single crate had gone missing. He smiled as they screamed. Estevao wrote, "And still they call us civilizers." Catarina read the letter and knew her son had reached a precipice, the same one Vasco had once stood upon. The difference was that Estevao had the vocabulary for doubt. She had given him that. She replied with only one sentence, "Power that costs nothing teaches nothing." Then she prayed, not in the chapel but in the olive grove. The trees had borne fruit early that year. She pressed the olives herself, mixing the oil with the salt carried by the wind. She placed a vial of it beside her bed, as if to remind herself that even sustenance could come tainted, that even blessings could sting. Visitors still came. Artists, priests, nobles. They wanted her to lend her name to causes, her likeness to paintings, her story to legend. She refused them all. One artist, young and trembling, begged her to sit for a sculpture commissioned by the crown. He said the statue would stand beside that of Vasco in the Royal Plaza, a tribute to the union of empire. Catarina asked him a single question. "Will they carve the names of the dead into the base?" The boy blinked, then fled. She continued her work. The hidden court had grown quieter, more careful. One of their members had lost her estate in a sudden legal dispute. Another was married off to the edge of France. The others wrote in code now. Their messages passed through embroidery patterns, recipes, pages of poetry. Memory had become subversion, and Catarina, though she no longer walked freely in the palace, was still spoken of there. Some called her mad, others dangerous. A few called her necessary, but none called her forgotten. One night, a knock at her door. Courier. Royal seal. A summons. The king wanted her to attend a banquet in honor of a new trading alliance. Dignitaries from Spain, from the Papal States, from Venice. A show of unity, prosperity, divine right. She did not want to go, but she did. She wore no jewels, no embroidery, just a black gown with sleeves rolled to the wrist, her hair braided with olive twigs. When she entered the hall, silence fell. Not from reverence, but from discomfort. She had become a living reminder of what the empire wanted to forget. But the king welcomed her with practiced warmth. He offered her a seat near the dais. She accepted. The meal began. Toasts were made. Songs were sung. Dancers twirled. Then came the moment. A bishop rose to speak, praising Portugal's glory, its mission, its righteousness. He invoked Vasco da Gama by name, called him a vessel of God, a hand of justice. He raised a goblet and said, "Let us drink to the crown built on faith." Catarina stood. She raised her own glass, filled not with wine, but with water. And she said, "Then let us also drink to salt, for it preserves, and it burns, and it stings, and it is what we taste when we bleed." She drank. No one else did. That night, she returned home and added a final page to the book of cost. It read, "The crown is built not on gold, nor on faith. It is built on salt. And salt, though it preserves, never forgets where it came from." She sealed the book, buried it beneath the olive tree her sons had planted. And she slept, not as a widow, not as a queen, but as a stone in the tide, refusing to be washed away. It began with ink. A shipment of documents arrived at Catarina's estate, bound in red ribbon and accompanied by a letter bearing the royal seal. The handwriting was precise, the language deferential. The King's Council, it said, had ordered an official historical record of Vasco da Gama's expeditions to be submitted to the Royal Archive and copied for courts across Europe. They requested Catarina's assistance. Specifically, they asked for her to provide any maps, journals, or annotations Vasco may have left behind. Anything that could complete the glorious picture of his voyages. Catarina read the letter in silence. She set it beside her bowl of morning olives and stared out the window for a long time. The the sky above the Tagus slate gray with early spring. She knew the gesture. It was not a request. It was a search warrant in lace gloves. She had long suspected this moment would come. Glory demanded order, and order demanded narrative. The Empire needed clean stories, lines drawn straight across oceans, victories etched into compass roses, saints in sailors' clothing. What it could not afford was ambiguity, or guilt, or the jagged edges of memory. She opened the cedar trunk that held what remained of Vasco's private maps. They were not what the crown wanted. Some were unfinished. Others were corrected by his own hand. Routes struck through with ink, new coastlines scribbled hastily over old ones, borders that bled between kingdoms and ports. A few bore annotations in languages Catarina could not read, names of local rulers and warnings not to anchor near certain shores. One map, worn and brittle, had a single phrase scrawled across the western Indian coast. The sea here swallows names. Catarina chose carefully. She selected 5 maps, accurate, clean, unthreatening, and had them copied by a scribe in town. The originals she returned to their box. One, the most damning, she removed entirely. The map that bore no routes, only circles, places not to return, marked in ink and blood. Places where too many had died. Places Vasco had written off not as failures of navigation, but of soul. She placed this map on her writing desk, and then she burned it. The parchment curled quickly, the ink turning to smoke. Catarina watched the flames lick the edges of history, her face expressionless. She wasn't erasing the past. She was protecting it from mutilation. That evening, a visitor arrived unannounced. He was young, dressed in the gray and blue livery of the Royal Archives. He introduced himself not by name but by title, assistant to the Historical Commission. He brought with him a list. It detailed all materials the Crown believed she still possessed, including copies of logs, sketches of the Malabar coast, and a rumored letter from a Mogul scribe. His tone was courteous, but rehearsed. Behind every "if it pleases you," Catarina heard the teeth grinding of state machinery. She invited him in. He sat at her table. She poured him tea. He asked questions. She gave brief answers. He requested documents. She promised to consider. Then, as he rose to leave, he placed a smaller envelope on the table. It was unsealed. Inside was a map. Not Vasco's. A new one. It bore the same path his voyages had taken, but smoother, wider, impossible. There were no notes of resistance. No mention of shipwreck. Every coastal city was marked as converted or welcomed. Every border clean. Every ocean tame. Catarina stared at it for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "Who drew this?" The young man smiled nervously. "The Royal Commission, based on compiled accounts." She handed it back. "Then you've compiled a dream." He left without another word. That night, she summoned Tomas. She showed him the forged map, laid beside the real ones. She asked him what he saw. "Fear," he said, "of being wrong." Catarina nodded. She knew that fear. She had seen it in the eyes of nobles when truth brushed too close, in bishops who crossed themselves at questions too sharp, in sons who hesitated at the altar of empire, wondering whether it was their father's footsteps or their own they were meant to follow. But she also knew what lay beyond that fear. Agency. Tomas helped her begin the project the next morning. They would redraw the maps, not as tools of conquest, but as reflections of memory. Every coastline would bear dual markings. What the empire claimed, and what it cost. Where a port had been taken by force, they would draw a broken line. Where diplomacy had failed, a dotted one. Where entire communities had disappeared, a red circle with no name. They worked in the chapel. In silence. They used handmade ink. They sewed the finished sheets into a bound volume called Cartografia das Sombras, the cartography of shadows. It was not meant to replace the royal maps. It was meant to survive them. Meanwhile, the official version of history began to circulate. Cathedrals unveiled paintings of Vasco's fleet blessed by angels. Streets were renamed. Priests gave sermons equating spice with salvation. And in the royal archive, a single gilded map was mounted behind glass, a lie preserved in gold leaf. Catarina never went to see it, but she heard the stories of foreign dignitaries marveling at the cleanliness of Portuguese expansion, of schoolchildren being taught that Vasco met no resistance, that India welcomed him with open arms, that empire was destiny, not decision, and she began to wonder how many more maps would be drawn this way, how many more children would memorize shapes divorced from consequence. She sent a copy of the Cartography of Shadows to a monastery in Braga, another to a merchant's daughter in Porto who had begun teaching secret lessons on colonial ethics. A third she hid beneath the floorboards of the estate library. Then she called Estevao home. He arrived weeks later, leaner, quieter. His letters had hinted at change, but now she saw it written in the way he carried himself, less as an heir, more as a witness. He brought stories, not of battles but of questions, of governors who had begun to wonder aloud why rebellions had become constant, of officers who drank more than they fought, of merchants who demanded more for less, even as the ships returned emptier. The empire, he told her, feels tired. Catarina placed her hand on the table between them. It's not tired, she said. It's full. It cannot hold what it refuses to name. That night, Estevao found the new maps. He studied them in silence. He traced the red circles with his thumb. He asked no questions, only nodded. Weeks later, a letter came from the crown, inviting Catarina to attend the unveiling of a new monument. It would stand in the central plaza, a statue of Vasco atop a globe, one hand holding a cross, the other a scroll. The pedestal would be engraved with the words, "He showed us the world." Catarina declined the invitation. Instead, she walked to her olive grove and knelt beside the tree where she had buried the Book of Cost. She did not dig it up. She placed a second box beside it. Inside the new maps, and a note, "For those who inherit silence, let this be your compass." The wind was rising, and somewhere beyond the hills, bells were ringing for a crown built on stories no map could contain. There are wars that erupt with cannons and blood, wars that leave cities in ruin and banners trampled underfoot. But there are other wars, quieter ones, fought not in trenches, but in council chambers and over parchment, between handshakes and behind half-closed doors. Catarina had lived through both. The first had taken her husband. The second now came for what was left of his name. It began with a signature. The king, under pressure from factions within the court and from foreign envoys seeking stability in the east, appointed a new viceroy of India. He was a cousin of one of the queen's advisors, a man of noble birth but shallow understanding of the seas. Catarina had never met him, but she knew the type: polished, ambitious, eager to be remembered not for truth, but for triumph. His first act was to declare a reassessment of all past maritime campaigns, including those of Vasco da Gama. It was framed as a procedural review, a means to modernize the admiralty and align the nation's narrative with the demands of diplomacy. But behind the language of progress was erasure. The viceroy's office began requesting revisions to archived records. Journals were quietly removed from libraries, histories rewritten. In one manuscript submitted to the University of Évora, Vasco's third voyage was omitted entirely. In another, Catarina's name was replaced with the Admiral's household. She learned of this through Tomás, now a scholar in his own right, who had begun teaching at a school for the children of merchants and freed servants. One of his students had brought him a textbook, newly printed, bearing the royal seal. When Tomás opened it, he found a map identical to the one Catarina had refused. A page claimed Vasco's faithful aides had softened native resistance through mutually beneficial trade agreements. A paragraph declared that the family line of da Gama was elevated through royal guidance and strategic alliances, managed by the crown. The implication was clear. The Gamas were a product of monarchy, not merit. Their legacy was not their own. Tomas brought the book to Catarina. She did not shout. She did not cry. She went to war. But her battlefield would not be the plaza or the pulpit. It would be the realm she knew best. The quiet channels of power, the subtle corridors where stories are shaped not with swords, but with edits. She began by gathering allies, not soldiers but scholars. Women from the hidden court, archivists who had once served under her husband, former stewards, widowed merchants, dismissed tutors. She called them not to rebellion, but to vigilance. Together they tracked changes. They acquired copies of every new textbook issued to noble academies. They compared them line by line with older versions. They annotated the differences, traced their sources, and recorded the omissions. They catalogued not only what was changed, but why. Catarina compiled their findings into a second volume, The Record of Absence. It was not an argument. It was a mirror. Then came the accusations. A whisper in the court. Catarina was hoarding documents. Another, she was altering them. A third, she was influencing her son Estevao to speak against the viceroy in naval councils. The last rumor struck hardest. It was half true. Estevao had begun questioning the viceroy's decisions, especially his move to reroute ships away from safe harbors in favor of symbolic displays of power. He argued for diplomacy, sustainability, restraint. He was met with scorn, then silence, then threats. When word reached Catarina that her son might be removed from the admiralty, she moved swiftly. She did not write to the king. She wrote to his mother. The Queen Dowager had long admired Catarina from a distance. They were not friends. Court life did not allow that. But they were kindred women, both survivors of men's decisions. Catarina's letter was brief. It did not appeal to emotion. It appealed to memory. She enclosed with it a copy of the Book of Cost and 3 maps, Vasco's real ones. She asked no favor. She only asked that the Dowager read. Weeks passed. Then came the audience. An invitation, handwritten, not stamped, delivered at dawn. Catarina arrived at the palace wearing a gown the color of whetstone. She carried nothing but her name. The Queen Dowager received her not in the Grand Hall, but in her private library. There were no guards, no scribes, only 2 chairs and a fire. The Queen had read everything. She asked Catarina one question: "Is this war worth it?" And Catarina, without hesitation, replied, "It's not a war, it's a reckoning." The Dowager nodded. 2 days later, the reassessment of the Gama legacy was suspended. The viceroy was recalled to Lisbon for consultation. Estevao retained his post. A new commission was formed to reevaluate the National Maritime Archive, this time with Catarina appointed as an advisor. She did not celebrate. She returned home and walked into the chapel, where the altar still bore a single candle and the olive-wood cross her youngest son had carved. She sat in silence, letting the quiet wrap around her like chainmail. She had won. But what she felt was not triumph. It was clarity. The war had never been about maps or books or statues. It had been about memory, about who gets to tell the story, about who gets remembered and how. She had been called widow, noblewoman, matriarch, ghost. But now she was something else, a witness, and through her, a generation would remember that there are wars not fought with swords, but with silence, and that sometimes the sharpest blade a woman can carry is the truth she refuses to bury. The summons arrived on a morning thick with fog, as if the sky itself hesitated to speak. It bore the mark of the High Council, sealed in gray wax instead of royal crimson, a quiet sign that this was not a celebration, but a reckoning. Catarina turned the envelope in her hand before opening it, already knowing what it would say. The language was careful, veiled in legal formality, but the meaning struck clear. The Crown was opening a formal inquiry into the House of da Gama for mismanagement of colonial authority, unauthorized retention of state property, and obstruction of official narrative. It was not just an accusation. It was an erasure with a quill. They had not dared to challenge her in court while she had breath in her voice and allies in the Dowager's wing. But time, as always, was a weapon. The Queen Mother had grown frail, her voice no longer steady in council. Estevao, too, had been reassigned, conveniently dispatched on a diplomatic voyage to the Canary route. The Viceroy had returned, older but unbroken, and now moved behind closed doors with new allies, new documents, new maps. The war had not ended. It had only learned how to whisper. Catarina said nothing for 3 days. She walked the halls of her estate in quiet contemplation, stopping often at windows, as if watching for a storm she knew was coming not from the sea, but from the ink of clerks. She reread the summons twice more. Then she lit a candle and walked into her study. She did not look for the archives or the records or the sealed ledgers. She sat at her desk and picked up a quill, and she began to write. Not a defense, not a rebuttal, not an appeal, a chronicle. She titled it Testamento das Sombras, Testament of Shadows. It was not meant for the court. It was meant for history. She began with names: servants lost at sea, translators executed without trial, villages erased from maps. She wrote of the letters that never reached Lisbon, the letters that were intercepted, the letters burned. She detailed trade routes not in coin but in lives, how many enslaved for each shipment, how many ports left in flames after diplomatic visits. For each accusation leveled against her family, she recorded not justification, but context. She did not excuse. She revealed. Ink to her was blood without scream. She wrote through the night, her hands cramping with age, her eyes blurring with candlelight. Tomas brought her food, but she barely touched it. He tried to speak, but she lifted her hand, gently, not to silence him, but to say, "Not yet." The words were pouring now, not from memory alone, but from the marrow. On the third night, her hands shook. She dipped the quill again, only to see the ink spill slightly, staining the page in a dark blot. She stared at it for a moment. It reminded her of a wound. She let it stay. By the fourth morning, the document was complete, over 200 pages, bound in cloth, marked only with a cross stitched from thread, the same thread used decades earlier to mend one of Vasco's torn garments. A detail no one would know, but one she did. She placed the book in a cedar box. She gave it to Tomas. "Not yet," she said. He nodded. Then came the council's messenger. Not a soldier, but a clerk dressed in black, polite, expressionless. He delivered the official letter of summons for in-person testimony. Catarina, it read, was to appear before a tribunal of 3 judges, to answer for violations of historical fidelity. No jury, no public gallery, no appeal. The date? 2 weeks hence. She returned the letter without signature. Instead, she wrote a letter of her own, addressed not to the tribunal but to the people. She sent it to printing presses in secret, through the hands of merchants loyal to her husband's memory, through the daughters of scholars she had once tutored in silence. By the week's end, it had spread through Lisbon like wildfire. The letter was brief. "I do not fear judgment, but I do fear forgetting. Let it be known that what we call law is often the memory of the powerful, and what we call treason is sometimes the courage to speak. I will stand before those who accuse me not with shame, but with the weight of truth. If that truth must fall silent, let it fall loudly." They called it the widow's flame, and it lit something no tribunal could extinguish. The day of her appearance, the square outside the courthouse filled with women. Not protesters, not rebels, witnesses. They wore no banners. They sang no chants. They simply stood, holding olive branches in their hands, a quiet forest of remembrance. Inside, the council sat in velvet silence. They read the charges. They asked questions. She answered none, not out of defiance, out of decision. Her silence was sharper than rebuttal. Every pause she offered became a mirror. Every question unanswered revealed more than any reply. They spoke of dishonor. She remained still. They invoked law. She raised her eyes, not in challenge, but in pity. In the end, they declared her uncooperative. They passed sentence. Her family's archives would be seized, her estate reviewed, her position revoked. She stood only once. I have obeyed the only law I recognize. Memory. Then she walked out. She did not return to the estate. She walked to the sea. Tomas followed her, carrying nothing but the cedar box. They stood at the cliff's edge as the sun bled into the Atlantic. She took the box, held it to her chest, then turned away. They did not bury the book. They placed it beneath the altar of a forgotten chapel. Stone cracked, roof half collapsed, candles long since extinguished. She whispered a prayer, not to be spared, but to be remembered rightly. And when she turned to go, she left behind not just the record, but herself. What followed was silence. Years passed. No new statues were raised. No new history books bore her name. But in secret, the testament of shadows began to appear, in whispered lectures, in smuggled pamphlets, in the margins of forbidden texts. They called her mad. Then they called her dangerous. Then they called her gone. But in time, they called her something else. Necessary. Because what Catarina de Ataíde left behind was not just ink, nor blood, nor silence. She left behind a reckoning, and it was still being written. The letter arrived without warning, without seal, and without ceremony. Folded simply, yellowed at the corners, the script inside was unfamiliar, written in a hand shaped more by devotion than by training. It had crossed oceans to reach her, its journey marked by salt, mold, and time. There was no signature, no sender, only a place, Goa. Catarina opened it with trembling hands. The ink had bled in places, but the message was unmistakable. It told of a chapel, small, crumbling, hidden beyond the fortifications of the old Portuguese citadel, built on a rise overlooking the sea, where the wind howled through broken glass and the waves struck the cliffs with ancient rage. There, the letter claimed, was buried not only the bones of Vasco da Gama, but the ghosts of what he had become. She read the letter once, then again, then again. She said nothing for days. But something shifted in her eyes, in her posture, in the way she carried silence. Her household, though now smaller, noticed immediately. Tomas offered to read the letter. She refused. He did not ask again. Instead, she called for her travel garments. She summoned a trusted steward to prepare provisions, not for an estate trip or coastal retreat, but for a voyage. She gave no reason. When a priest came to offer blessing, she declined. I have already been blessed, she said. I survived. Within a week, she was gone. The journey was not easy. The ship that carried her cut through rough waters, through channels thick with storm, across a sea whose memory held her husband's footsteps. But Catarina did not waver. She stood often at the bow, gripping the railing until her knuckles whitened, her veil soaked with spray. The crew whispered about her. Some said she was cursed, others said she was a saint. No one dared to speak directly to her. When lightning split the sky, she did not flinch. She arrived in Goa under an indifferent sun. The harbor, once foreign, now bore the symbols of empire, crosses and cannons, markets and monasteries, the smell of clove and oil. It looked like Portugal, but it did not breathe like it. Catarina stepped onto the dock and paused. Not from awe, but from recognition. This, she thought, was where the tide of memory had broken. She did not go to the governor's palace. She did not kneel at the cathedral. She did not ask for audience or protection. Instead, she followed the map drawn inside the letter through alleyways past abandoned wells, beyond the reach of official cartographers. She found the chapel at dusk. It stood crooked against the sky, its stones dark with moss, its door hanging on rusted hinges. A tree had grown through one wall. Birds nested in its corners. The air smelled of dust and sea. Inside, there were no candles, no altar, only fragments, shards of iconography, a broken bench, a plaque whose lettering had faded to the bones of language. Catarina stepped forward and knelt, placing her palm on the cold floor. It was there that she felt it, not presence but residue, the kind of silence that hums beneath stone, the weight of unsaid names, the pull of buried stories, This, she knew, was the place. The letter had been true. She spent the night there, refusing the cot brought by a local attendant. She sat cross-legged on the stone floor, wrapped in her shawl, listening to the wind scream through the hollow window. She whispered nothing. She did not pray. She waited. At some point in the black hours before dawn, she slept. And in that sleep she dreamed. She saw Vasco, not as he had been in portraiture, but as he had once stood in their private chamber, stripping off a soaked cloak, exhausted, speechless, his beard streaked with salt, his hands trembling. In the dream he said nothing, but he looked at her with eyes that no longer held command, only question. She wanted to speak, but in the dream her mouth was full of ash. She woke with tears on her cheeks and sand beneath her nails. When the sun rose, she stood and began to clean. She swept debris into piles. She lifted stones. She righted the broken bench. She placed a small votive on the ledge, a candle she had carried in her satchel, wrapped in linen. She lit it with a flint and held it until the flame steadied. Then she sang. Not a hymn, not a lament, a cradle song. The same one she had hummed to her sons when they were sick. The same one she had sung softly on the night she received the first news of Vasco's voyage. The notes echoed through the chapel like birds waking. When she left, she carried nothing. She left the candle burning. Outside, the air had shifted. The town still bustled, soldiers still marched, bells still tolled. But Catarina no longer walked as a woman carrying the burden of empire. She walked as someone who had given it back to the sea. Back in Lisbon, they had not yet noticed her absence. The tribunal believed her estate was under surveillance. The royal archives assumed she was hiding. The historians, some of whom had copied her words in secret, began to circulate fragments. Tomás, however, knew where she had gone, and when she returned weeks later, her face sun-worn, her hands calloused, her voice hoarse, he simply opened the gate and let her in. She did not speak of Goa. She did not need to. But every evening after her return, she lit a second candle beside the one that always burned in the chapel at home. And though she never said the name aloud again, it was clear to those who knew her that something had been laid to rest, not only a man, but the specter of what he had built. She no longer answered questions about Vasco's voyages. She no longer corrected the official versions. She no longer engaged in the war of ink, because she had seen where it ended, in a chapel forgotten by the very empire it had served. And in that forgetting, she had found peace. Not forgiveness, not vindication, but peace. The kind of peace that only comes when a woman has walked through the ghost of her own history and come out the other side unbowed. The kind of peace that does not silence her, but allows her to stop whispering. She did not write again. She did not need to. The flame in Goa still burned, and in the memory of the wind, her song still echoed. By the time the first snow fell across the hills of Sintra, Catarina had already begun to disappear from the records. Not in body. She still walked the corridors of her estate, still tended the olive grove with hands stiff from age, but in narrative. Invitations ceased. Letters from the court grew infrequent and polite. Her name, once uttered in council chambers with reverence or fear, now surfaced only in passing, like a faded title on a forgotten page. But this suited her. It was in quiet that Catarina had always done her best work. In the last winter of her life, she took once more to her desk, not with purpose sharpened by fury or grief, but with the clarity of someone who had already surrendered the need to be believed. The wars had been fought. The truths, scattered across monasteries and memory, no longer needed a general. What remained now was testimony, not for the king, not for the church, not even for her sons, for those who would come after the forgetting. The journal she began was small, bound not in leather, but in rough canvas dyed with ash. She kept it beside her pillow, hidden beneath a quilt embroidered with salt roses, a pattern she had invented herself. She wrote by candlelight, never by day, and never with an audience. Tomás, now a grown man and scholar in his own right, suspected its existence but never asked. He had learned well the sanctity of silence. Catarina began with a simple sentence. I no longer write for the living. From there, she traced not events, but emotions, the fault lines between truth and memory, power and pain. She wrote of her youth, not as it had happened, but as it had been felt. The first time she realized her name would never be her own. The night she understood that marriage was not unity, but merger. The cold space between herself and Vasco even as they slept beneath the same roof. She did not indict him. She did not sanctify him. She remembered him, as a man pulled always by the wind, even when the sails were lowered. As a father who tried to hold his sons the same way he held a compass, gently, but with purpose. As someone who had come home more of a myth than a man. She wrote of the nights she'd spent sitting awake beside the fire, listening to the breath of children and imagining waves crashing somewhere far away, of letters never answered, of maps never honored, of prayers whispered into pillows that returned only with dust. She wrote of women, of the hidden court, now scattered across provinces and convents, of the Queen Dowager, long since buried, her name already misquoted in printed hagiographies, of the merchant daughters who once met beneath fig trees to exchange stories written in the margins of cookbooks, of mothers who had sent sons to sea, and never again received more than a coat or a medal or a line in a sermon. She named them all, first names only, but each one written with reverence. She wrote of fear, not the kind that comes with swords, but the kind that arrives in soft footsteps, in red wax, in rumors spoken over shoulder-high fans. Fear that dressed as civility. Fear that silenced not with threat, but with exclusion. She wrote of the day she found her name omitted from a court genealogy. A blank space where wife should have been. A newer print, newer ink. And no sign that she had ever stood beside the man whose empire now stretched across stained glass windows and cathedral domes. She laughed when she saw it. Then she wept. Then she wrote it down. Each page of the journal became a counterweight to forgetting. A candle against erasure. She did not know if anyone would read it, but she believed someone would find it. Not soon. Perhaps not even in the next century. But one day, in some monastery library, or beneath the floorboards of a ruined chapel, or in the attic of a crumbling house whose walls still smelled faintly of clove and salt, someone would find the book, and they would read it, and they would remember. When the final page was filled, Catarina closed the journal with a trembling hand. She wrapped it in linen. She placed it inside a wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread. Then she rose and walked through the cold halls of her home, past the empty nursery, past the sealed study, past the maps that had long since curled with age. She stepped into the olive grove at dawn. The frost kissed her cheeks, the earth stiff but not frozen. She dug the hole herself. Not deep, just enough. She placed the box inside, covered it with soil, and whispered, "Now you belong to time." She said nothing to Tomas, not because she feared interruption, but because she trusted legacy. He found her the next morning, asleep in her chair, the fire still glowing. Her breath was shallow, her fingers ink-stained. She did not wake again, but the candle beside her bed burned steady. They buried her beneath the oldest tree in the grove, as she had once requested in a note no one remembered writing. There was no marble, no inscription, just a stone, smooth, unmarked. Years passed. The empire wavered, bent, then broke. Names rose, then fell. Wars came, but in the soil, beneath roots that had grown thick and gnarled with time, a journal remained, waiting. And when it was finally found, decades later, by a young archivist cataloging forgotten estates, it bore no title, only a sentence. I no longer write for the living. But through that journal, Catarina spoke again, and the silence, for once, listened. Long after the empire had changed hands, long after the banners had faded and the altars been reconsecrated, long after the coins had lost their faces and the maps been redrawn, the olive grove still stood. It had outlived the Da Gama name in politics. It had outlived the wars. It had outlived memory, and that, Catarina might have said, was the only legacy that mattered. People forgot her. Not suddenly, not with malice, but with erosion, like cliffs worn smooth by generations of wind and tide. Her name became a footnote. Her portrait, once carefully commissioned but never displayed, disappeared into a private collection. The archives she had guarded were repurposed, reassigned, renamed. The records of her tribunal were lost in a fire the year Lisbon burned. Only the olive trees remained. Visitors came from time to time. Scholars tracing bloodlines, priests seeking solitude, travelers drawn by rumor. They walked the grove in silence, felt the wind shift through the branches, smelled salt in the air despite the distance from the sea. Few knew what they sought. Fewer still found anything. But some paused beneath the oldest tree, the one whose roots bent like outstretched fingers and whose trunk split at the base like a scar. There, the air seemed heavier. There, the silence hummed. They did not know her name, but they lingered, and that, too, was a kind of memory. Years turned to decades, decades to centuries. Portugal's glory dimmed. The oceans once ruled by its fleets grew indifferent. Its colonies, long bled dry, demanded voices of their own. The statues crumbled. The churches emptied. The books were rewritten again and again. And still the salt remained. In the mortar of walls. In the bones of sailors buried beneath churchyards. In the stories told by women in kitchens. Of grandmothers who once received letters with no return address. Letters that smelled faintly of candle wax and jasmine and sea. It was salt that kept Catarina alive. Not in body, but in meaning. Because salt does not rot. Preserves, and stone does not speak, but it remembers. A monk in Braga copied passages from the Book of Cost by hand, unsure of its authorship but haunted by its precision. A seamstress in Porto passed down a lullaby that bore the melody of a song once sung in a broken chapel on the western coast of India. A child in Goa, exploring the ruins near the edge of a cliff, found a rusted coin wrapped in linen and ink. He brought it home. His mother placed it in a bowl of oil. That night, she dreamed of a woman kneeling beside a tree. None of them knew they were remembering her. But they were. Catarina's legacy was never meant to be grand. It was not a monument. It was not marble. It was not even a name. It was the instinct to ask, what did it cost? To question the weight of gold. To wonder about the names missing from the page. To see a map and ask who drew it and who it erased. Stone and salt, these were the materials of her empire. Stone that stood long after voices ceased. Salt that seeped into every wound, stinging until truth surfaced. And because of them, Catarina endured. Not as a queen, not as a widow, not as the wife of a man who conquered oceans, but as a reckoning. In Lisbon, a statue was finally raised to honor the early navigators. A grand column etched with ships and saints and royal crests. Vasco stood atop, sword drawn, eyes toward the horizon. At the base, carved in smaller script, a single phrase, they carried the cross and the crown. No mention of Catarina, but in a quiet garden just beyond the city, where the wind bends low and the sea cannot be seen but always felt, someone. No one remembers who carved a different inscription into the side of a chapel stone. She carried the silence. No date, no attribution, just those 4 words. But every spring the olive tree blooms early, and every winter the candle inside the chapel, though unlit, bears the scent of smoke. And every now and then, when the fog rolls in from the coast and the streets fall still, a scholar will pause, and a child will listen, and a wind will rise like a voice long buried. And someone, somewhere, will ask, who was she? And in the answer, Catarina returns. She does not appear in the paintings. Her face is not carved into the arches of cathedrals, nor does her name echo in the chants of schoolchildren reciting the lineage of kings. She is not footnoted in the chronicles of conquest, nor awarded title in the scrolls that preserve the naval triumphs of Portugal. History did not erase her. Simply never made room. And yet, Catarina de Ataíde endured not through fame, but through persistence. Not in the grandeur of empire, but in the spaces it left behind. She lived in the pause after the anthem, in the hesitation before the plaque, in the whisper that rose just after a name was spoken and someone quietly asked, "Was there a wife?" History forgot Catarina because she was never meant to be remembered. Because the tale of empire is told in the voices of men who carried flags across oceans and believed that planting a cross in foreign soil was the same as salvation. Because those who built the ships, and blessed the voyages, and paid for the maps, and bore the children, and held their homes together with sinew and silence, they were meant to disappear. Catarina understood this. That was her genius. She understood that to survive history, she did not need to shout. She only needed to record. She only needed to remember. And more importantly, she needed to endure. There were days when she faded from even her own reflection. Days when the mirror offered nothing but shadows and duty. When she wrote letters she knew would never be read. When she lit candles not for hope, but for proof of existence. When she stood in the center of an empire and realized she had become its breath, invisible, necessary, uncounted. And yet she chose to stay, not in submission, but in power. The kind of power that resists spectacle, that refuses inheritance, that questions what it means to be part of a legacy built on blood. She taught her sons how to speak with conscience, how to calculate not in profit, but in consequence. She taught strangers to question maps. She taught orphans to write, and she kept the records, not just of deeds, but of cost. Every death, every name, every silence. She buried the truth not to hide it, but to save it, to protect it from the hands that would twist it into gold. She left behind no lineage that ruled, no castle that carried her crest. She left only pages, stones, salt, but they were enough. Because long after the empire fell, long after the flags changed and the statues cracked, those who still searched for truth found her. They found her in the testimonies scribbled in margins, in lullabies sung with words too old to trace, in hidden journals pressed between bricks of ruined chapels, in a name uttered once in a dream and never forgotten. They did not always know her face or her story, but they felt her, the weight of her questions, the gravity of her witness, the stillness of her defiance. Catarina de Ataíde did not discover lands, nor did she rule them. She did not burn villages, nor baptize them. She did not plant flags, nor salute them. But she buried the empire's bones in pages they could not burn. She carved memory into silence. And she waited not to be vindicated, but to be heard by the ones history would try to forget next. The women who would come later. The ones who would read her words in secret. The ones who would hear her name in the wind. The ones who would understand that power, when wrapped in silence, is not absence. It is preparation. It is resistance. It is legacy. Today there is no grand monument to Catarina, no day of honor, no liturgy, but in the quiet spaces between stories, in the breath between the pages, she remains, not as myth, not as martyr, but as memory, not remembered by history, but remembered by those who need her most. The woman history forgot became the woman memory refused to lose, and that is how she won. History rarely stops to look back at the women who stood still while the world moved. It rarely honors the hands that held letters unsent, or the eyes that watched from shorelines as men sailed into legend. It builds its monuments for conquerors, not for witnesses. And yet, without Catarina de Ataíde, the ocean empire might have been built with sails, but never with soul. She never commanded armies. She never ruled a province. But she recorded what others refused to remember. She planted truth in silence. She taught that empires aren't only measured by where they expand, but by who they erase. We tell ourselves that history is made by those who act. But sometimes, history is preserved by those who endure. Catarina's story is not only hers. It belongs to every woman who held the line in quiet, who kept memory alive when others tried to bury it, who understood that legacy isn't always made of stone. Sometimes, it's made of paper, of ash, of breath. And now, as her voice rises again through time, carried on wind and word, we are reminded that the greatest revolutions don't always roar. Some whisper, and some, like hers, echo, forever.